Welcome to the American Library in Paris. I'm Rachel Donadio. I'm the curator of cultural programs here at the library, and it is a great pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening and on Zoom for Claire Messud in conversation with Dan Gunn. We are thrilled to have you, Claire, to talk about your new book, This Strange Eventful History, an intimate family saga of love, loss, and exile, and also a shortlist finalist for the American Library in Paris Annual Book Award of 2024, and we're welcoming you back because I know you spent some time here before. Claire and Dan will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions from you in the audience and then from some of the many people who are joining us on Zoom. How many of you are here at the library for the first time? Well, welcome. We hope you will come back. We hope you'll become members. We are the largest English language lending library on the European continent, and we host a vital series of conversations and Anglophone intellectual conversation in Paris. So we welcome you here. Claire Messud is the author of 6 works of fiction, including The Emperor's Children and The Woman Upstairs. She is a recipient of a Guggenheim and Radcliffe Fellowships and the Strauss Living Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts with her family. Dan Gunn is Distinguished Professor of Comparative Literature and English at the American University in Paris, just across the way. He is a novelist, critic, and translator. His critical works include Psychoanalysis and Fiction, Wool Gathering, or How I Ended Analysis, and his novels include Almost You and Body Language. He is director of the American University in Paris's Center for Writers and Translators and series editor of its Cahiers series. He was co-editor of the 4-volume Letters of Samuel Beckett and is currently editing the Letters of Muriel Spark. Please join me in welcoming Claire and Dan with a big round of applause.
Thanks very much. Thanks to Rachel, an old friend, and very nice to be here with Claire. So I'm here to introduce Claire's novel, or at least introduce Claire and her novel. The title comes from, call him Jacques or Jaques' speech about the 7 ages of man in Shakespeare's As You Like It, This Strange Eventful History. And in fact, the novel focuses not just on one individual's life, but on the lives of 3 generations of a family, or perhaps even 2 families, all of whom are affected to a greater or lesser degree by the one historical event that, though it's never described in detail, structures their lives in countless nameable and unnameable ways. That's to say, the Algerian War, the colonialism which precedes it, and the exile of the Pieds Noirs population during and after it. It's a huge and hugely impressive novel, encompassing enormous changes in the world from the Second World War, where it begins, to 2010, where it ends. It's a novel consistently focused less on historical events per se than on the lives lived in the wings or interstices of history. So I thought I'd start by asking Claire to read a little bit from her novel, get her voice.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Dan, and thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. It's very thrilling to be here, yeah, it's just great to be here. Gosh, it's nice in Paris. I hadn't been since before the pandemic, and I've been sort of wandering around saying, "Oh, it's so beautiful. It's very beautiful." Okay, in case you forgot, it's very beautiful here. So I thought I would just read a page from the prologue. So just to say that the novel takes place over 7 decades, and there's a section each decade with 2, but mostly 3 points of view within that time. And it's almost, in my mind, it was almost like putting a sort of probe down in a particular moment. So the 3 points of view happen sort of, if not simultaneously, very close in time in each decade. And and all the points of view are third person, close third, except one, and the prologue is the first person, who then doesn't appear, as a character named Chloe, who's of the third generation, which corresponds curiously to my own, and does not that character doesn't appear until sort of midway through the novel after the prologue. So this is just a little excerpt from a fairly brief prologue. I'm a writer. I tell stories. I want to tell the stories of their lives. It doesn't really matter where I start. We're always in the middle. Wherever we stand, we see only partially. I know also that everything is connected, the constellations of our lives moving together in harmony and disharmony. The past swirls along with and inside the present, and all time exists at once around us. The ebb and flow, the harmonies and dissonance, the music happens whether or not we describe it. A story is not a line. It is a richer thing, one that circles and eddies, rises and falls, repeats upon itself. And so this story, the story of my family, has many possible beginnings or none. Mare Nostrum, St. Augustine, Abdelkader, Charles de Gaulle, my parents, Larba, my father, my aunt, Zora Drift, my mother, Albert Camus, Toronto, Cambridge, Toulon, Tlemcen. Oh, Tlemcen. All and each a part of the vast and intricate web, any version only partial. Or I could begin with my birth or my father's birth or his father's birth or my mother's or grandmother's. I could begin with the secrets and shame, the ineffable shame that in telling their story I would wish at last to heal, the shame of the family history, of the history into which we were born. How to forget that after attending the birth of his first grandson, my father, elderly then, tripped on the curb and fell in the street a toppled mountain, and as he lay with the white down of his near bald head in the gutter's muck, he muttered, "Not help me, but I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I could begin, of course, with the aloneness. Or I could begin with the fact that the owner of our local pizzeria and our former next-door neighbor is an Algerian man whose surname is also the name of the provincial Algerian town of his ancestors, the same town in which my Pied Noir grandmother taught at the girls' school in her youth in the years before she married, years that were in her case numerous because she didn't marry until her mid-30s, then an age by which women were deemed unmarriageable. She might even have taught my neighbor's grandmother or great-grandmother. Or I could begin with the fact that the beloved Lebanese friends of my grandfather's pre-war posting in Beirut include the great-uncle of a dear friend of mine in this American life almost a century later, whose daughter played with our son from the time they were round-limbed toddlers. Or I could begin with the angels on my father's last journey to death, the witnesses to his many lives who appeared, sentinels and guides along that final path to guide him, the ultimately homeless, to his eternal home. It doesn't matter so much where this story begins as that it begins. And if, as I've come to understand, the story is infinitely expanding rather than a line or thread, then wherever I start is merely that. Not the beginning, but a mere moment, a way of happening, a mouth.
Thank you. One of the clearest themes of the novel, and it's one that I think is likely to speak loudly to your audience today, is that of homeland, of home, a word that has no obvious French equivalent, homesickness, and how these relate to another issue that is likely to be of concern to this audience, that of nationality. Of the male character of the middle generation, François, the father of the narrator that whose introduction you just read, of him it's said that he didn't have a home. He absolutely had a home, his home since he was a small boy. He meant Algiers, of course. So the disappearance of home has, quote, left him rootless. And after this, there follows a paragraph about his wife's school friend, Adele, who has come to Canada from Hungary. And I'm quoting, Adele wasn't exactly Hungarian anymore, but she certainly wasn't Canadian. So I was wondering if you could just say a few things about this word home and maybe even how it relates to the question of nationality, because they're not, coterminous really, and how you see their relation working in the novel and maybe more broadly, if you like.
Yeah, I think that the 20th and now 21st centuries are about migrations of smaller and larger sorts, and that the experience of living always in the town in which you were born is now quite rare. I think it does still happen for some people, but for most of us, that's not the reality. But I think, you know, the 20th century, certainly the mid 20th century, was a time of massive migrations. We live now in a time of another set of massive migrations. And then there does become this, you know, there arises this question of what is home. There's a wonderful essay that you may know now, used to be recent, and now it's long ago, by Salman Rushdie, called Imaginary Homelands, in which he writes about the fact that once you've left somewhere, you're changing, it's changing. The homeland that you knew exists only in your mind. And I think, you know, that's true. You know, that's true for all of us. As soon as we go from one, I mean, you don't have to change countries for that to happen. You can just go from one city to, or one town to a city, you know, and then the world is forever changing. So I think that experience of when you were saying there isn't really a word in French, and I was thinking about Heimweh as a, you know, I mean, I think that experience of Heimweh is all but universal. Maybe not entirely, but all but universal. But then there's the other experience of not even being able to go back. Of a place, the place that you knew being for whatever reasons impossible to revisit, and I think, you know, I think that's something that is actually also sort of tragically commonplace now. That certainly in this time, in this present life, you know, we could list, you know, many cultures and countries where people have been unable to go back, and I think, you know, there's a sort of complication in this particular history, which is my sister's here, which is our family history, because the Pied Noir legacy is not, you know, that thing of well, it's a whole complicated story, but it's certainly not something where I think the side of justice, right, is not on the side of the former colonial families. So in that sense, it isn't a story that is. I had a very interesting conversation with a British Zimbabwean white journalist who said there's a lot of shame in being a white Zimbabwean, and is there a lot of shame in being with the legacy of being Pied Noir? And I think, you know, that's a particular sort of tributary, I guess, if you will, in this sort of.
And just the relation to nationality, is nationality just a way of trying to cover over nostalgia or nostos, the wish for a home? Because nationality doesn't really, you know, a lot of people here will have questioned their nationality or have adopted French nationality, or it's a big question even for the more privileged amongst us who have choices. And in the novel, there's the where you are from and where you go and which nation you adopt is quite a question that doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with home either.
No, but I think, you know, one of the things. So one of the many strands that were behind this book, that were part of its genesis for me. Our grandfather, who was born in 1905, in his retirement in the 1970s, wrote for us, his grandchildren, a memoir which he called Tout ce en quoi nous avons cru, everything that we believed in, and one of the things, and it comes up in the novel, but not in the way that he includes letters and telegrams and hotel receipts and all sorts of things. But there's a letter that he wrote for his children at the time of the war, to be opened, like something in a novel, to be opened in the event of his death, or the event of his and my grandmother's deaths. And they survived the war, and so the letter was never given to their children, who were small. They were born in the 30s, and so they were small at the time of the war. But in that letter, he says, what you need to know about our family is we are, in this order, very French, we are Mediterranean, we are Latin, we are Catholic, we are French. That's who we are. We are those things. And so when I was reading that as a lapsed Protestant North American, right, I was thinking, wow, that is a distance, right? That in not much time, there's been a big distance. And then I became aware that the world that I was raised in, which was a post-war world in which there was, after the horror, so much hope. There was a sort of maybe enforced hope, but there was a sense we have to open the world, we have to rebuild, we have to make sure never again. But part of that is a globalism, is a cosmopolitanism, and nationalities will wither away and borders will disappear. And for us for me in my youth, 1989 was this great moment where we thought we're heading towards a great future where everybody will get along. So for my kids, it doesn't really look that way. My kids are 21 and 23, and it doesn't really look that way. And so part of writing this novel is saying, maybe there were a lot of mistakes along the way. Maybe there were things we didn't take into account. Maybe there was a flawed rationale, but there was also a lot of optimism in the vision, and that the vision was almost against nationality. The vision was about transcending nationality.
Thanks. You'll tell me if I'm wrong, but one of the less obvious themes of the novel seems to be the relation between something like necessity, what has to happen, and contingency, between what inevitably will happen to a person and what may happen by chance and by luck if you're fortunate. It's really hard to do chance in a novel, or the random or contingency, because of course we all know that the writer has gone over it 100 times, it's been plotted. Chance, contingency, coincidence doesn't often come across very convincingly in a novel, but you somehow managed to do that. I've thought about this quite a bit in relation to Muriel Spark, whose letters you mentioned I'm editing. She gets around this problem, for instance, in relation to coincidence, which rarely feels like coincidence when written, by amplifying and multituding coincidences to the point where they just seem absurd almost. Proust is a master here. I think it does fit the long form because you can have people disappear and then re-emerge. Someday something can surprise you. I'm very impressed by your ability to reveal to the reader that not everything is plotted in the lives of your characters, that we don't all have a life path that we're following and that in retrospect will make sense to us. I just want to read this very short passage in which it's the granddaughter Chloe, who the voice that you started with, who's a nervous child seeking to hold the world together, who fantasizes that there is indeed a supererogatory plot that ensures that everything makes sense. And this comes for the very end of her first chapter. It goes, all the connections we see and do not see. Sometimes we feel alone, but we are always more closely connected than we think. If you understand it all, maybe you can be like God and protect everyone. So in a way, my question is, if you could just talk a little bit about your art as a novelist and how that relates to necessity, what you feel must happen, and contingency, what just turns up, and how perhaps this relates to the playing God that any novelist is likely to feel.
Okay. That seems like a hard question. Okay. I mean, I in a funny way, I might, I suppose I might frame it almost the way that I was approaching it. I was about this, the intersections between individual lives and the sort of greater forces of history, and that's we're all living in history, and we don't often think about it, or maybe we do think about it and then we let go of the thought because we have to get to the hardware store and buy a ladder or something. But the reality is that just humanly in my, this is not in the novel, I don't think, but this is a real life thing. I remember when we were kids and there was a picture of, we lived in Sydney, Australia, and there was a picture of Liberace crossing a tarmac to get on a plane. and our dad was right behind him and was in the Sydney Morning Herald, crossing the tarmac. And we were like, oh, look, we were so excited. Like, there's Dad. Nobody else was, I think, so excited because our dad was not a celebrity. But that's a very sort of tangential moment in which, but looking at the lives of this generation, and the generation that was of my grandparents and parents, and just the degree to which history just kept in different waves coming, and that within that there's some agency, obviously, and then in other respects you are. It's perhaps worth saying. So the first section of the book takes place. The book opens in what is now. It's not the very first. The very first belongs to François, who is of the middle generation, born in the 30s. But then the second is about his father, who is a naval attaché for the French military, military in what is now Thessaloniki, in Salonica, at the time of the fall of France, and to think about what was known and not known, and how you had to make a choice about. You hear that speech, June 18th. You hear that speech, and you have to make a choice. And different people in that situation, in that town at that moment, made different choices that arose from different circumstances, and in the case of the character Gaston in the book, he doesn't know where his wife and children. He's sent them back to Algeria, but he doesn't know if they got there. So his primary concern is, how can I find my family, right? What's going to be the best way for me to find out if they're okay? I mean, that's and I feel like that's what life is handing us all the time.
Absolutely.
So I would just say, novel-wise, I feel like I'm sort of against plot. I feel like I'm sort of. I mean, one has to curate a little, but I feel as though there are writers who I admire in all sorts of ways, and then I feel like, but they're tying things up too tightly, right? They want things to be too neat, and it always seems to me that that the aim is to capture life. That's always my aim, is to capture what life is like, some little bit of what life is like. And life isn't as orderly as we want it to be.
Yeah, and in that sense, you're also working against the readerly instinct, which is always to make sense of things, that somehow you want the plot to be a plot, that it will make sense at some point. And of course, you managed brilliantly to hold together the sense of something that had to happen, and then the choices, and sometimes the non-choices, just things that happen to people, particularly around aging and illness. So it's this idea of playing it God in a way. It's, again, maybe just because I'm thinking a lot about Muriel Spark at the moment. She definitely felt that the novelist was a somewhat immoral art in some way, because they did to some extent play it God. They knew the future of their characters, and you use this a technique that she uses a lot, prolepsis, or telling people's futures before they get to it.
She does use it a lot.
She does.
I love
she
that.
Really does. There's just a little example. The little boy painter from the school in Goulburn, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, didn't know yet in that house that he would grow up and go to France to teach paintings with the artists my French relatives take me to see in a museum in Paris, any more than our relatives could know that just by chance Lulu and I would stand in the schoolroom in the middle of nowhere where that boy would become an artist, maybe first drew first drew a picture. So it's that sense that you're telling the future of their, which to them is, you're telling the past, but to your past, but their futures. How did that feel? Did it come naturally, that technique of sort of, in a way, it's often in brackets?
Well, I feel like it came from Muriel Spark.
Yeah,
but
she does do it.
Yeah, but I think it. I mean, we don't know the story of anything until it's over. So we don't know the story of our lives till we're dead. So we don't actually ever know the story of our lives. So there is a godlike thing as a writer in sort of imagining or the arc, the full arc of characters' lives. But I feel as though that there's also, it's impossible. Come on, in Paris, the palimpsest, right? The palimpsest experience where you're like, and here I am, and here's where it's the same cafe that my parents went on a date in 1956, which is also the same place that, Joseph Roth was writing, the Radetzky March, and right? And which is also the same place that in, I don't know, 1792, something, right? Like, I think that sense of the stories overlaying one another, and that, and yes, that question of what's known and by whom and when, and isn't it interesting? That's not a very profound comment.
No.
It's interesting.
I think it partly raises this same issue, and sort of relates to my next question of how. I don't want to ask you how far is it true or not, although of course I do want to ask how far is it really based on your family and how much is invention. But because it is to some extent based on your family, then that sort of puts an extra element in it, because you do know their histories, as it were, which if you just made them up, well, you can make them up, I suppose, to end however you want. Anyway, one of the more fascinating, and you've alluded to it already, aspects of the novel for me is this multiple point of view. The narrator espouses most of the time, I think, what Flaubert calls famously style indirect libre, so third-person narrative that holds very close the perspective of the principal person, or the protagonist, as it were, of each chapter. And then, and there are several different characters, so there's at least 3 or 4 points of view. And then almost exactly...
There are 5.
5, is it? Yeah.
It's all prime numbers.
Okay,
there are 7
good.
decades, there are 5 numbers, there are 23 sections.
Almost exactly half the way through the novel, abruptly a first-person narrative suddenly appears, which really was, ooh. And the tale is told from the point of view of the granddaughter, Chloe. But we don't quite know yet who she is. And later, too, she tells her side of the story in the first person. So I wonder, just if you could say something about this shift to first person. Was it something that came automatically because somehow Chloe is closest to you, or was it something you later thought of, or how did it come about?
Yeah, so I'm a great believer in intuition. I would just say, which is sort of difficult as a teacher of creative writing. I'm like, well, trust your intuition. So there's an element of that, right? So, but I would also say that one of the things that for me is also happening in the book is over 7 decades, which is quite a long time, is a move to the interior. Right, is that the way the book starts is much more a conventional. There's some interiority, but it's much more traditional narrative, and that as the novel progresses, it's getting, both in the third and the first person, it's getting less simply. More interior. It's getting more interior, and so and there are lots of reasons for that. For me, I think to do with access in some way to the material. Like, I did a ton of research for this, and some of it, of course, was family archives and so on. But a lot of it was also reading. They're also. Am I right? I think there are 5. Are there 5 continents? Are there all? No, 3 continents. How many continents? I don't know. Anyway, there are a bunch of continents as well as a bunch of people. It's one of those things. It's like I say to the students, it's kind of like that thing, Jackass. If somebody says, like, I'm going to try this, you'd say, don't do that. Don't do that at home. In The Information, Martin Amos's novel, The Information. There's the character is working on a novel with, I believe it's 7 unreliable narrators, by which we know that he will never succeed. So it was sort of like that. But there was a lot of research. So there's some sense in which by the time we're getting to a world that I know, and to a character of my own generation, then I feel intensely free to sort of enter that character's psyche in the first person.
But would you want the reader, there's a very sort of naive question away, would you want the reader to think that was you? I mean, you, the author, or would you want there to be a perceptible gap, insofar as you can control that, between you, Claire Messud, and Chloe?
I don't. I mean, it's a fiction. For me, it's a fiction. So I've tried to describe it to people as, if you think of it as papier mâché. You take a coat hanger. There is a structure, which is the places people in my family moved to and some of the things that they did. It's a structure. you take a coat hanger and you end up with an elephant. Right, you wrap a lot of newspaper, wet, gluey newspaper around it, and you end up with something that's sort of different. So, I mean, one of the things there is a bunch of stuff that comes from life, and there's a bunch of stuff that's made up, and that's why I'm a novelist, and it isn't a memoir, and I don't really. But I can't control how people read it or understand it, and I feel like that's not my. Luckily, that's not my job. So I sort of feel as though my hope above all, is one of the things I love about fiction, right? One of the things I love about language, is that it's alive. It's a medium that's alive and changing, and it means something different to each of us. So if I write love, that means that comes from me with a whole set of baggage, and for each reader, it's a different set of baggage. So each of you is reading a different book, and you make the book, which isn't the same when you see the movie, because it's why when you've read the book and you see the movie, you're like, the house doesn't look like that. Right, because you imagined the house, you have your own version of the house, right? So as a writer, I feel like your hope is that you set parameters, that you make it directed enough so that nobody has a completely wild experience that would be like the bad guy is a good guy, although who knows, right? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. No,
but beyond that, you're like, go for it.
I can imagine it, even though just on a daily basis, because it's a long novel with immense amount of integrated and interwoven facts that you can actually historically verify. Names like Jacques Derrida crops up a couple of times, but not in the obvious sense of someone necessarily reading him, though that also is there. But actually, he was also moved from Algeria. So it's that sort of when you read the novel, if you haven't yet read it, I'm sure there'll be moments where you want to go, I'm going to check on Wikipedia, and you'll find that really is that happened.
So, for example, there was a great moment when Philippe Sands said to me, "Why did you put John Hemming traveling up the Amazon in your novel?" John Hemming, by the way, went on a trip up the Amazon in the early 60s with one friend who I'm afraid got blow-darted to death by an unencountered Amazonian tribe. And then the other person on that trip was Kit Lambert. If you see who Kit Lambert is, who's like the rock music, who was he with? What was his? Was he Pink Floyd? Anyway, I mean, he wasn't a musician. He was like a manager. Anyway, but that was before he was that. Anyway, and then it turned out that John Hemming's daughter is Philippe Sands' editor in London. So the world is very small. And I said, well, that was because it was in my parents' letters that they knew John Hemming in Cambridge, and then they heard he'd been on this trip, and they were talking about it on the phone. So.
No, imagine it, because even I really recommend to you as well Claire's collection of essays, Kant's Little Prussian Head and Other Reasons Why I Write, because in that there's autobiographical essays which we can take to be written in your person, as it were.
Yes.
And they're, just to give one example, Denise, who's a major character in the novel, she's the aunt of Chloe. She's named as Denise in this as well, whereas other characters change their names, and that's, I can just imagine that must have been a constant choice. You have sometimes the real name, as it were, and sometimes not, and it's sort of fascinating as well. Just to open out the issues a wee bit about writing. One further question, and it's by way of one of the essays here in the chapter called Two Women, which speaks principally about your mother, Margaret, and your father's sister, your aunt Denise. So after a quick summary of what led to the Algerian War and the creation of France's Fifth Republic, you consider the impact of these seismic changes in the geopolitical landscape on your aunt Denise. And you write, it's a beautiful passage, a lyrical or mythic narrative of what resulted for lonely young Denise might glancingly propose that the violence and distress of the nation, France's inability to maintain power over its colony, Algeria, while at the same time being unable to liberate it, manifested as a crisis in my aunt's psyche. she, a young woman who could neither be free from her abandoned homeland nor at home in metropolitan France. Whether her collapse, that's a psychic collapse, I suppose, was precipitated by the unattainable love of a man, a family, or a country, her Algeria, or whether by the political unrest around her and the ways in which she saw herself as implicated in that unrest, as a young Pied Noir woman in Paris, passionately committed to a French Algeria, surrounded by peers who largely felt otherwise and considered her a colonial in the metropole as an interloper, it's impossible to know. And was perhaps impossible to know even then. She fell through no fault of her own on the wrong side of history. She fell through the cracks of history, perhaps, and she fell alone. And so when I read that, I thought, would it be wrong to suggest that you perhaps think that the job of literature, particularly of novels, is to take what was impossible to know even then and to make it in some way knowable, or at least imaginatively graspable, and by that means to make your Aunt Denise not exactly or entirely alone, to save her from falling entirely through the cracks of history? Or more broadly, is it fiction's job to take up where biography, memoir, and historiography necessarily leave off?
Yes, I think there's that. The Penelope Fitzgerald with the Blue Flower takes as the epigraph. It's about novelist, and she takes as the epigraph, literature exists to fill the gaps of history, and I feel like maybe I'm mangling that, but that's essentially what it says. And I really feel that. I feel that actually the reality of life is overdetermined, and it's overdetermined by human beings and our emotions and our reactions. Somebody did a play years ago about Reagan and Gorbachev walking in the woods, and like the end of the Cold War was because Reagan and Gorbachev met, and they had that animal feeling of like, hey, I think I kind of like you. I think I can talk to you. Right? And sometimes people have the opposite feeling, which is you give me the creeps, right? And that's very bad for international politics, right? You give me the creeps is not a good feeling to have about your interlocutor. So but everything's there are 10 or 20 things, and I think for me I always get a little flummoxed about science fiction. Many young people love to write now speculative fiction, which is great, except that I feel like this world is so effing interesting. Like, it's just so interesting. And there's so many experiences and stories that haven't been illuminated and recounted, and so many emotions, and I feel like fiction's about all we experience that doesn't break the surface, but we all share it. And when we read it, we have that moment of recognition where we're like, I know just what that was like. And that encounters history, when that encounters actually historical events, I think it can feel transformative. And so, yeah, the answer was yes.
I'll ask a final question, then hand it over to the audience. In the introduction to this collection of essays, which were assembled, as I understand it, during the COVID lockdown in 2020, you write of an, quote, overwhelmingness that has been a widespread experience of the last 5 or 10 years, the last 5 or 10 technologically dominated years. And you continue, it's a terrible fate for human beings, distinguished from other animals precisely by our ability to conceive of the passage of time, as well as the capacity for laughter, let's not forget. To lose our sense of a plausible future is to lose our humanity itself. And you go on after that to strike a note of optimism, an optimism partly staked in the ability of communities to come together against the COVID threat, and partly on a long-standing faith in what you call the possibility of original expression of authentic experience. A possibility on which you say, as a writer, I have staked my life. This optimistic tone feels rather different to me from the tone of so much of the novel. Jacques, or Jacques, in As You Like It, is the embodiment of melancholy. And there's a lot of melancholy in this novel. This doesn't put you off. It's very plangent, it's very beautiful. But there's a melancholy of loss, of aging and its vicissitudes, its separation, pain, physical pain. And in the end, secrets that hurt and perhaps bind, the weight of the unsaid and the unsayable. So I'm wondering how in the 5 years since you wrote that essay, and I'm presuming this novel, since we came out of lockdown, since we've had to witness the emperors of our digital worlds attempt to control our politics as well, how your faith is holding up both in possibility of community and the possibilities for writing, of what you call the actual irreducible and irreplaceable animal record, the movement of the hand that holds the pen, the imprint of the ink upon the paper, the dignity of intimacy of the individual letter written for a particular addressee and hence so different from a blog or post without thought of other readers. It's a beautiful passage.
So maybe, thank you, Dan. Thank you. Maybe I'll just say something starting there. I feel like I'm a little like somebody on a soapbox in Hyde Park about certain things, and one of them is the force of letter writing, and which we don't really do now. And one of the things that, in researching this novel, I was going back through boxes of letters that my people in our family were often separated and wrote letters. And for example, my father went to study in the United States. His family was in Algeria. He went to study on a Fulbright in 52, 53. And I don't have the letters he sent home, but I have all the letters that they sent to him. And I was aware as I opened them that you could see they had been hastily torn open, probably leaving the post office box, room at the college, walking across the campus, reading them in haste, and then stuffed back in the envelopes, and that I was probably the next person to read them, so that they'd been read in February 1953 and again in 2017, And one of the things about a letter is it's somebody's voice alive. And it's what they care about alive, and it's in the moment. It doesn't have the arc of history or recollection, and so what I experienced reading all the letters, which I also experienced reading my grandfather's memoir, was these people alive in the present to me in a time before I knew them, utterly alive. And we feel that. That's why you're editing Muriel Sparks' letters, is because we feel that when we read letters in a very particular and special way. And I think it's a terrible thing to lose that form of communication. And we don't have to. There are many ways to communicate at length. My children make fun of me because I text in sentences, but what can you do? But I feel like that's still a form of communication. So I do. I feel that we're like medieval monks. It's possible, but we're not all dead yet. And the other thing I want to, in my zealot way, I want to try to convince my kids of, at least, is that all of those platforms that take your time are not neutral, and they're somebody's controlling you and making money off it. So actually, if you just put that down and write a letter, you're free, and we have the capacity. So on the one hand, on the other hand, you can't just pretend that the world isn't as it is. And one of the things that since I wrote that essay, that I've been thinking a lot about, as I think, I was saying to you, there's an American academic named Stephen Kern who wrote a very wonderful book in 1983 called The Culture of Time and Space, 1880 to 1920. And he's talking about how the technological advances of that period completely revolutionized the way people experience time and space, and that some of the results of that the effects of that were felt across the culture, and just Einstein, Picasso, James Joyce. Those are all effects of this change. If you think about it, before I shouldn't get going. I've given some lectures to undergrads, like I shouldn't get going because you're like, oh, it's been 50 minutes. But standardized time had only just happened, right? And there were a lot of reactions, including, if you remember, Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent, which is about trying to blow up Greenwich Observatory, right? There were a lot of feelings about standardized time, and not all of them were good. Anyway, that's a period that occasioned a complete revolution in people's thinking and cultural production and so on. And just this past year, Stephen Kern, who's now of an age, I think, published a sort of update which includes 1980 to 2020. Because, of course, we have just gone through an analogous, completely a huge upheaval of technological revolution, which, if you think about time and space as the fundamental ways by which we chart our lives, we've internalized, it's changed the way we've internalized time and space, and that this is affecting narrative and communication. And so it's not possible to say that doesn't exist, but I still have to hold out a faith that we can still communicate.
Thanks very much. Over to you in the audience.
Could we have a round of applause, please? Who has a question? I know there are some burning questions out there. I see it in your faces. See, right away.
Yes, I very much enjoy your novel, which I found was beautiful. But when you tell the story of your Pied Noir family, there was something that I found, I was a bit surprised, and I would like to have your reaction about that. In their life in Algeria, they didn't seem to have any relationship with the Muslim community that surrounded them and finally expelled them after a terrible war. And as if they never spoke to each other. So how do you explain that?
I don't think that's entirely true. I mean, in terms of in terms of the sections in the novel that are actually in Algeria, there's the section which is François as a child, having just arrived and doesn't know anybody, and then there's there are two sections in the early 50s, and that's all that's in Algeria. And in one of them, the patriarch Gaston is at an oil prospecting project near Gardaya, and he doesn't actually speak to anybody. I think it's all in his head, but he does think about the colleagues. And as I recall, I mean, I did write it. You'd think I'd recall really well, but that's a lot about interactions between the French and the Algerians there, because there's a refusal by his superiors in Paris to promote an Algerian man who he wanted to promote in that position, and also there's a big problem that they have because one of their drivers caused an accident that killed two actually Moroccan workmen in another truck. So it isn't about having friends who are Algerians, but it's certainly, I think, in my. And then I think the other is the Denise section, and that section comes largely from letters. And when a friend who's French Moroccan read that section, and she said, "Don't you think you should make her more aware?" It's set in 1953, so it's set literally like a year before things really begin. "Don't you think you should make her more aware of the political situation?" And I said, "But I know for a fact that she wasn't aware, and that she lived in her own French bubble, and that at that time, if you read the history, already there were student activists. There was a lot going on, particularly at the university, and people who were both French and Algerian who were working for change, right? But it's like saying, oh, in 1968 there were plenty of people who were not really paying attention until so for me that was part of what I was trying to convey, was the way that in fact people were living obliviously. And I think we hopefully change and evolve and life gets better, but I think there are things that now we're living somewhat obliviously to, that in 30 years people will say it's impossible that they didn't notice that, So so it was with an awareness of that limitation in her case.
And in one of the very final chapters, there's a very, very touching moment where Denise, the aunt, who's in so many ways unfortunate, has a beautiful relationship with the cleaner of her building, who happens to be Muslim, and religion, and she's devoutly Catholic, and they completely transcend the cultural and religious differences in that chapter. It's beautiful.
I think alcohol is involved also.
It's true.
Somebody else?
Hi, Claire. First of all, good to see you again. A question about you talked about it a lot already, about sort of history versus fiction, and kind of how did you decide, if you had a method other than instinct, which bits of your own history, your actual family's history, and like bigger history with an H, you included versus how much you invented? Was there a method?
I think intuition was the method. I mean, I think one of the things, was also insofar as there was I was trying to choose in each decade moments that had some historical resonance, perhaps. May, June 1940, early in 1953, which is before, but as I was saying, at a time when things, when there was a lot of sort of movement and discussion. Actually, for people who were engaged, there was a lot going on in Algiers, and so on through the, but it was also. I found myself a little nudgy, like this was just a me thing. I had trouble. I could make up things, but I found I couldn't move things historically. I say that, and then there's one that there is one thing that I did move, which but a minor thing. But almost always it was about sort of keeping some that thing of if you actually did go look things up, you would find that that there wasn't something that was historically inaccurate. Because it seemed to me my responsibility was to, as it were, weave a tapestry around what was, rather than to have a freedom to kind of change it.
I'll try to speak in English, but I'm not too good. If I am not mistaken, 20 years ago you wrote The Last Life. So when you compare the two books, you wonder if you wanted to go back to the history of your father and develop it with the eyes of we have today. Is it the purpose, or is it completely separate from The Last Life? And may I just add a comment?
Could you speak into the mic, because the people on Zoom won't hear you otherwise?
I like very much the way you write. It's a Proustian way to pivot on emotion at certain point, which is very, very moving, I think. But my question is about The Last Life and the relation with this book. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so I published around the turn of the century a novel called The Last Life, which is set in the south of France and is about a girl and her Pied Noir family. And people thought that was related to my family, and it was not. I thought I was so clever on the papier-mâché front. There were stories that I'd heard, and I thought I'm going to take those stories and I'm going to put them with my family's Pied Noir history, and I'll put them together and I'll make a fiction. And then after I finished it and showed it to my aunt, she said, "That family's Pied Noir, you know." So actually, it wasn't. I thought I was. It's as if I thought I was taking this from over here and this from over here and putting it together. But actually, no. Anyway, it was fiction because I didn't really. I mean, I think one of the things, I don't know how many people in the room write fiction, but you're making stuff up, eh? That's kind of the deal. You allow yourself a freedom to invent, and so certainly until this novel, which is much closer to sort of family or personal experiences. I've been everything else has been a sort of magpie thing. You can't write without any experience or connection or psychological understanding. But you really can be a magpie and say, I'm going to take this, I'm going to take that, put them together and make something new. And so that novel was very much, that earlier novel was very much sort of putting together a number of different things. It wasn't about my family history. And this one does hew more closely to a family history. Also, for me, it's just a much the scale and the ambition. My ambition, at least, was much bigger. So, as I was saying earlier, about trying to capture something about the entire second half of the 20th century, about the way that the world that I knew growing up, and that seems to have really actually since 2010 to have changed. I mean, obviously things were changing before we got to, or they wouldn't have changed so radically. But it's like saying in America, the election of Trump in 2016, it didn't come out of nowhere. It came because of the world had been changing in the years before that, right?
Thank you so much for your discussion. The book is set in Canada, Australia, south of France, Massachusetts. How hard did you actually go to Australia to write the Australian bits? How did you research the bits that were in different countries? Because I thought some of your description was much better and much more realistic than others, and I thought perhaps you hadn't been to Australia.
I grew up there. I was a child there. I grew up there. I didn't go back there while reading the book, but I did grow up there, and so yes, the places that there were a couple of places that I mean, sort of ironically, Algeria, I went in November for the first time for 4 days. It's not that easy to go to Algeria, and I was invited as a guest of the U.S. State Department. And I haven't been to Buenos Aires, and everywhere else I've been.
Thank you so much for this rich conversation. And Dan, thank you for your thought-provoking and rich questions. Claire, I am interested in that idea mentioned briefly about characters sort of recurring in different books. And I wonder if that is something that you are conscious of or something that you embrace in your writing, and what that might say about the works that you produce, the body of work that you've produced, and just how you sort of think about that as it's coming up for you as you work. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a good question because I don't think of myself as someone who has characters recurring overall, and I'm a great admirer of a number of writers who do that. But it's true that I had this book of personal essays, many of which are literary criticism, and about half of which are personal essays, and so because of the overlap between family stories, there are characters who show up in the personal essays and also show up, some with different names, in the novel. But I think it's an interesting thing to get to. somebody said to me about this book, why now? And I feel like, because if not now, then when? I'll be 60 and not that long. So if not now, then when? So I think there's some sense there are all sorts of maybe ideas or boundaries or that I held for much of my writing life, and I feel now, why? What was that about? Why that? I think the recurrence of characters is in part about urgency, is about feeling, which doesn't mean they will recur again, but I think that I feel more strongly as I age that there's no time to waste and no pussyfooting around, and it's we need to just write what feels to us important. Yeah.
Something occurs to me. I think I'm probably misquoting him, certainly misquoting, but not, I think, misrepresenting him. Proust says somewhere, all novelists write one novel. You either split it up into lots of, like Dostoevsky, I think, is an example, but you see that the characters somehow recur, or they write one very long novel, or he really wrote a couple, but really with one long novel, or you write lots of little novels which are, from his point of view, sort of one novel. But that's only with the backward gaze, I think, of time that we can start to see just how coherent writers of his, as Claire's is.